Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this union session, which is entitled "Make Facts Great Again," but colon, how can scientists stand up for science? My name is Jonathan Bamber. I'm president of EGU, and I'll just run through how we're going to run the session. It's a little bit different from a sort of standard union session. We've got four fantastic panelists, who I'm going to introduce. They're going to say a few introductory remarks, 4 or 5 minutes each on the topic. I'm going to give them some sort of seed questions that they've already seen to sort of prompt the discussion. And then after about 40 minutes, so we're going to open the floor up for questions from the audience. So, please do think about the issues that come up in the first half of the session and ask these guys, those tough questions that you really want the answer to. So I'll just introduce the topic, the kind of background and the rationale for having this session. This is kind of to set the scene, if you like, and then I'll introduce our panelists. So, in some countries, political events of the past year have highlighted a growing distrust of experts, a rejection of inconvenient facts, and a wish to make national borders less open. All three hinder the progress of scientific research. In the US, the start of Donald Trump's presidency has seen gag orders on some US government scientists, hire freezes, immigration bans, and a trend towards dismissing mainstream scientific evidence on issues such as anthropogenic global warming and the safety of vaccines. Meanwhile, Brexit is expected to limit access to EU funding for UK researchers and restrict the free movement of people. At a time when some politics seems at odds with science, what can scientists do to further the progress of scientific research and ensure mainstream scientific views are accepted and taken seriously by policymakers and the public? So that's kind of what we want to discuss and debate here. And in no particular order, it's just the list they are on my sheet here. I'm going to introduce our absolutely fabulous panel. We're really, really lucky and privileged to have these four panelists here today. Christiana Figueres was the Executive Secretary of UNFCCC, United Framework Convention on Climate Change, from 2010 to 2016, and the mastermind, if you like, behind the Paris Agreement. And she is currently founder of Mission 2020, based in London. Sir David King was the Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK government from 2000 to 2007. That was during the Blair government years. And more recently, actually until I think about a month ago, he was the UK Special Representative for Climate Change to UN. Heike Langenberg is the Chief Editor of Nature Geoscience and actually the founding editor of the journal, which was launched in 2008. And Christine McKinty is the Executive Director of EGU and has been for about the last 7 years. So that's our panel members. So I think we'll if we start with Christine, and if you want to say a few introductory remarks, and then a few minutes each, and then Christiana. Sorry, Christiana. Sorry. Similar name. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Who am I looking at? Yep. Let's go from left to right. Yeah. Christiana. Yep. Far away.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And good morning to all of you. I just have 3 quick points that I want to share with you as an opening. The first, do not be intimidated. This is the moment for science. I was at the Science March in Washington just a few days ago and was taking photographs of posters. And my favorite poster was, "Things are so bad that even the introverts had to come out to march." And I think that is the spirit of the moment, right? This is the moment to come out. This is exactly when, not to be intimidated, but really to come out and help to establish the scientific, to reestablish and to strengthen the scientific underpinnings of all decisions of mankind, frankly. There is no other underpinning that is as strong as science for anything, any human endeavor that we know of. And this is the moment in which to really, even if you're an introvert, come out and help to strengthen the underpinning and the scaffolding upon which we are constructing the future. My second point is about speaking in an understandable form to those who are not scientists. So I have a quick experiment here. How many of you understand Spanish? Right. All of you who understand Spanish are going to be my control group for the next little experiment. Please do not opine when I ask a question, okay? So here's my little experiment. En este momento yo les voy a hablar en español porque lo que es importante es entender que es completamente imposible entender un idioma del cual uno no entiende. Right. Control group, please do not say anything. Those who are not in the control group, did you understand anything of what I said? You did? You're not supposed to. Here's my point. Oh, you understood the words, but not the meaning. Okay, very interesting. The words, but not the meaning. Here is my frustration, okay? Scientists you are up there in your labs, in your ivory towers, and when you come out and express yourselves, we mortals do not understand you. We do not understand you. So my plea is, in addition to the fantastic work that you must continue to do, can you please translate it for mortals? Because we're the ones who need to understand and take the implications of what you do and translate it into decisions, into policies, into corporate decisions. And if we don't understand, there is nothing that we can do about it. So please, this is the moment in which everyone is called upon to make an extra effort. We're not here in a business as usual scenario, right? We're here now in a scenario in which everyone must make an extra effort. And the extra effort that I would very, very deeply request from you is to please try to speak. I'm not among yourselves, which you're fine, but when you speak to others, please try to translate so that we can understand what you're saying to us. And my third point is, and when you do speak to others in understandable language, please speak outside of the tent, in particular to business, in particular to policy people, because it is policy and business that are actually making right now the critical decisions that are going to determine whether we have a future that we're proud of or whether we have a future that is unbearable for the next few generations. And those two universes, policymakers and business, do not forget about business. Business is making critical decisions right now that are really going to take us either one way or the other. And we need that input from you in understandable language and at the appropriate point in time. We need to understand the risks that are involved so that those decisions can actually mitigate the risks.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Christiana, for the starting talk. I have got 3 points to share as well. That seems to be the standard format. First one is, I think what we encounter is more a disregard for science and not so much an actual attack on it. The second is, you can't beat narratives with facts. And the third one is, many of us think that facts speak for themselves, but I think that's a misconception. Facts actually need trust. And that is something we need to gain. So on the first point, science is now just seen as one opinion among many, I think. And there's no longer a unique authority ascribed to science, especially where it is politically relevant, such as in climate change. On the one hand, policymakers are partly responsible for that by cherry-picking results in politicized science to argue for their preferred solutions. And that promotes the impression, of course, that science couldn't just support any side of a debate. On the other hand, however, scientists have offered their views on what one may call scientized political issues. And they have thereby entered the kind of public bazaar of opinions, which can be negotiated. There's an example. In a recent policy forum in science, Johan Rockström and co-authors write, and this is a quote, "In global governance, climate stabilization must be placed on par with economic development, human rights, democracy, and peace." That's quite a strong statement, and that's not indisputable evidence-based science, a fact if you want, but a political statement, a value judgment of what's important. Now, of course, scientists are entitled to political opinions, just as any citizen of the world, and this is a policy forum article, so it is meant to be an opinion piece, but in this case, the prominence of the political statement comes from the author's scientific authority and not from their political authority. And these statements then enter the public domain under the heading of "scientists say that," and it sounds like a scientific statement, and the public then perceives no clear distinction between what are facts, what are scientific hypotheses that we still need to test, and what are mere opinions of scientists on matters that are not really their core expertise, perhaps. So can we change the disregard for science? I suspect not. I think the discussion has moved on to a place where the perception has settled in that scientists too deal in opinions and not just in facts. So I don't think we can go back on that. But what we can do and should do, I think, is keep emphasizing what science can't do and can do. So we very rarely can provide complete and final truth. That's important to stress. Science is search, and the search will go on. There's always open questions. Science can't make value judgments. The question whether peace and democracy are more or less or equally important as climate stabilization is not something science can actually help with, I think. What we can do is we can analyze the reasons behind observations, for example, the causes for melting glaciers. We can propose hypotheses for how the natural world works, and we can test them. And we can make often imperfect predictions based on current understanding. We can predict the next solar eclipse, but for global mean temperature rise, for a given rise in atmospheric CO2 concentrations, we can only provide a likely range. But at least we can give some indication what might happen. Second point, you can't beat narratives with facts. Humans like stories, they tell stories, they listen to stories, and they are influenced by stories. And unfortunately, whether these stories are factual doesn't really matter all that much. There are many narratives out there that are irreconcilable with science. So what scientists can do is they can create narratives too. And if you reread Jonathan's introductory statement, you will know that the organizers of this session understand. And you see what happened, the room is full. But these narratives from scientists must be rooted in reason. And in making stories about science, we must make sure we always include the evidence and the uncertainty, just to be firm. Third, facts don't speak for themselves, they need trust. The problem with facts is that it's very hard, often impossible, to prove a fact. Conversely, it is very easy to make up a false story that sounds very plausible. So we need to inject factual evidence into the public discourse. We really need the audience's trust. We cannot fly everyone to the Arctic to see that sea ice is melting. And there are very few people who can run a global climate model and analyze the output. So we need this trust. Now I can think of two ways to build trust. One is to really understand our audience and to choose our moment to talk to them. Christiana already mentioned that. You know, for example, if there's a weather-related disaster, the public opinion swings towards thinking, okay, you know, weather extremes might be becoming more frequent. The 2003 summer heat wave convinced the Europeans, Hurricane Sandy convinced New Yorkers, the California drought convinced the Californians. Whether the event is actually attributable to climate change is a different matter, of course. It not always is. But in the wake of such events, the public is very receptive to scientific analysis because they want to understand what happened to them. They want to know what's going on. And these are the times to really speak up. These aren't the only times, but in these instances, it's particularly important to speak up. And whether the evidence suggests climate change had a role or not is, again, not the point. The point is that this is an opportunity to really engage with the public when they are listening and they want to know. And secondly, communication is the message that is received and not the message that is sent. What is received, however, depends on the listener's mindset, and you first of all have to understand that. Otherwise, you will never get there. And again, Christiana, you have to know, does somebody speak Spanish before you start talking Spanish in them, because it's not going to arrive, it's not going to be received. So I think to gain trust, scientists also must listen to a variety of people and understand their outlook on the world. So read the tabloids, mix and discuss with people of a different background, talk to your taxi driver, leave the echo chamber of like-minded people. The problem is we all talk to scientists all day who all have the same opinion, and then it's very difficult to understand how people think and what people doubt and where people's problems with the scientific evidence is who are not scientists. And talk to these people with the expectation to learn, not with the expectation to teach them something. That's the other problem. I think we often talk at people rather than trying to understand what they are thinking. And secondly, to gain trust, we can engage trusted mediators, and I guess that's where the science journals come in, so that's really my expertise, I suppose. All the rest was outside my expertise. I should put a disclaimer here. Peer review can create trust, I think, but this is mostly among scientists, and less so with journalists, and probably least with the general public. What I think science journals can do is promote transparency and reproducibility, make code and data traceable, publish full accounts of the methods of investigation, publish the contributions of authors to a paper, and so on. Be honest about mistakes. If there's a reason to retract a paper, do it. Be transparent about that. Do it quickly, of course. Be vigilant about overreach in authors' conclusions and hype in press releases, so make sure reporting is truthful as possible, obviously. Ensure any claims, especially extraordinary ones, are backed up by sound evidence. Ensure hypotheses, uncertainties, caveats are all clearly flagged and quantified where possible. And take utmost care with peer review, obviously. Check reviewers' email addresses rather than using what the authors have supplied. Carefully evaluate reviewer reports. We try to do all that, obviously. But never mind how much trust we build. I think the glorious times of the 1960s are over. Then the great challenge was to fly to the moon. Scientists and engineers made it possible, and the world was duly in awe. The grand challenges of the 21st century are not like that. They are the sustainability goals, sustainable development goals are one example. They involve life and human actions. They are not just hard problems like flying to the moon or predicting a solar eclipse. The grand challenges are wicked problems, problems that cannot be solved because the requirements to solve them are contradictory and the knowledge is incomplete and the goals are changing as well. So they can only be approximated and not solved completely. So to tackle these, there's no way around cooperation between science and society at large. I think in the best possible outcome, science will gain people's trust and engagement along the way. And that would be a great success, even though we will never again have people's awe in the way we had it in the 1960s.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I am going to be bringing a U.S. science policy perspective because that's what I know best currently. So I'm not here to talk about world policy as well as these two can on my left and on my right. The first point I want to make is that despite what you read in the headlines, the intrusions into scientific integrity and support for funding investment in the United States for science is not a new issue. In fact, the intrusions into scientific integrity and funding support have been around for quite some time. So if you look in, let's take funding first. If you look at the percentage of the U.S. budget since 1970, but normalized to 2016 dollars, has been relatively flat as a percentage of the federal budget since 1970, with a little bit of an increase after the Recovery Act in 2008. The big increases in funding in the U.S. have come on the health side with the National Institute of Health. But overall, the percentage of the budget has been relatively flat for sciences in whole, and for earth and space science in particular. Also, the issue of intrusions into scientific integrity are not something unique to the election of Donald Trump. So in the past two Congresses before his election, there were bills to reauthorize the funding. It's called the US Competes Act for the funding of the National Science Foundation. There were provisions proposed to put in those bills to actually have Congress determine among the different scientific directorates of the National Science Foundation what the level of funding would be every year through congressional appropriations. Those were defeated. The bill was reauthorized without that, but these aren't new things. There were already proposals to actually defund a lot of things related to climate science, for example, in the government agencies. What was different is that you had a White House that was really willing under President Obama to push the limits of executive order, to enact policy changes, and to use the veto pen if needed. But it wasn't like they were governing as a unified Congress and administration. In fact, we haven't seen kind of really strong governance and bipartisan governance in probably the last decade in the United States. So this polarization is not new. And the politicization doesn't just come from the right. There are instances before this election where members of Congress who were Democratic and quite liberal actually were trying to get the emails of scientists and initial drafts of their testimony as evidence that they were skewing the scientific data in support of their testimony because the scientist was going to question some of the uncertainty that was being presented by other scientists on the panel. So it's not unique. It's heightened on the far right, but the far right and the far left actually both pull snippets of information to make their policy points of what they want to see enacted in policy. That brings us to November 17th and the election of Donald Trump, which has been quite unsettling in the United States, not just scientifically, but for a whole host of other reasons. And the rhetoric in that campaign and some of the recent actions by people that came out of the campaign to run the government agencies has certainly, and with great validity, heightened fear and anxiety among the scientific community, particularly in the agencies that regulate businesses such as the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy, not as much in USGS and the Department of Agriculture and Commerce. It's not correct, though, that everybody that is heading those agencies or been nominated does not accept climate science. There are people in their confirmation hearings. Rick Perry was one. The person who's heading, Wilbur Ross, who's heading Commerce, Ryan Zinke, who's heading the Department of Interior, were asked point blank if they accepted that humans influence science, and they are on the record saying yes. I'm sorry, humans influence climate. Thank you very much. And they are on the record saying yes. What they're going to do policy-wise, I don't know. Secretary Tillerson was the same, and so was Defense Secretary Mattis. So it is correct that they are taking actions, early actions, but it's not necessarily predictable exactly what they're going to do, as you can tell. So that's kind of my second point is we're in a very unpredictable time. And it's not clear that this administration, even though they have a Republican Senate and House, is going to be able to govern in a coalition and in a majority than any other past Congress and administration over the past 10 or 12 years. This president has the lowest approval rating of any president in modern times, where we've been measuring approval ratings in his first 100 days. They made really huge mistakes in the Affordable Care Act. They couldn't get anyone to support them. So the Republicans in the House are having the same problem they had during the Obama years, controlling about 20 or 30 people of the very far-right Tea Party who will vote against anything to make a point. And so they're having difficulty governing as well. So that turns us to what will happen with funding and scientific integrity. I think the final point I want to say is that in Congress, there are bipartisan support for Earth and space science. So there is an Earth and Space Science Caucus. It is co-chaired by a Republican and a Democrat. It was launched last year. 300 people attended the announcement of the caucus, and there is strong bipartisan support. There is also bipartisan support for accepting the science behind climate change. There is a climate caucus, and it is headed by a Republican and a Democrat. It has about 20 members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, who are trying to get more and more people from both parties to just make a statement that they accept the science, but they're avoiding how you solve the problem at this point because it's so politicized. So it's, you know, it's a really time of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear. But to me, he's done more to wake up the scientific community that they need to speak up and they need to listen. And from an AGU perspective, that's where we're looking about how do we take that energy and motivation and continue it not just in a science march, but give our members and their supporters simple tools and techniques they can use to be able to actually raise their voice, be comfortable, even if they're introverted, speaking out and doing it in a way that others can listen. And my final point is I really think it's important for scientists to listen. I grew up in a very small town in western Pennsylvania where they used to strip mine. The stream in my house was solid orange the whole time I grew up. We did not have the scientific expertise to know what was actually in there, but we knew that we shouldn't go near that water. That town has been economically devastated since 1980. Now people are selling their land rights for hydraulic fracturing because they're poor. It's not because they want more devastation of their land. It's not because they don't accept scientific facts. There's nothing else there. And so we need to listen to what their problems are and then explain how our science can help them solve not just their concerns about pollution or water contamination, but how can science help them get economic growth again? How can it help give them jobs? How can it help their children leave those areas and get the kind of education that we as scientists or myself as a policy kind of expert have been able to have the opportunity to have? And I think that's the way we can really connect most effectively if we lead with listening and then engage, as opposed to saying, here's all the things that we need to solve quickly, which are correct. That's factually correct. The world challenges are wicked and complex, but I really think listening is really important first. So thank you.
Until the year 2000, I was a full-time scientist with a large research group in Cambridge. I was head of the chemistry department, and I never imagined I would get into government. And the British Chief Scientific Advisor post was developed by Churchill when he took over at the beginning of the Second World War. And he simply said, I've got to have a scientist at my right side. And that was such a successful appointment that the position has not only continued, but it's grown. And the Chief Scientific Advisor in Britain is in a wonderful position. You have a large budget and a large office. So you can have quite a big impact. Now, I was offered this position in 2000 when Britain had been suffering from the BSE crisis. And the worst aspect of that crisis was when a minister went on television feeding his daughter a hamburger made from beef to try and reassure people that it was perfectly all right to eat beef, even though it was possible that the animals had BSE. Now, what was he doing? He was disregarding the science advice within his own system, which was already showing that there was a possibility that spongiform encephalopathies would develop in human beings if they ate the meat. But he was protecting the beef industry. And this is an example where science produces results which don't fit in with the model that is creating funds for a group of people. Now, the problem is that the trust in science collapsed in Britain around that time. All these polls indicated this. And when I took over, I simply said to Prime Minister Blair, I'll take the job on one condition, and that is every bit of advice I put into you, within 3 months, I put into the public domain. So the public knows what advice I'm giving, and you know that it's going to go into the public domain when you make your decisions. Now, that put Blair in a difficult position, and I wouldn't say that our ride together was altogether comfortable. But the point is that openness, honesty, and transparency were, for me, the key elements in regaining trust of the public in Britain. And actually, the polls swung round quite quickly. We had a foot and mouth disease crisis shortly after the end of the BSE crisis, and this was even bigger. It eventually cost the country about £6 billion. And I was brought in, we had to model the epidemiological process using mathematical models that I was quite familiar with, so it was quite satisfactory from that point of view. But we were working 24/7 to produce a control procedure that would work, and we did it, but I was on television and radio every day saying what we would do, and then reporting to the Prime Minister every day. And in this way, we took the public and the farmers with us through a very dreadful period, and within 2 days of implementing that process, the curves followed what I'd already put out on the television screen. Actually, it was a bit uncanny. The models were more accurate than we could have really hoped for. The trust then produced in Britain, you referred to funding for science. What it produced was a threefold increase over the following 8 years in British funding for science. We suddenly became, within Europe, the best funded scientific grouping, and then that led to us, and here's a big catch, it led to us becoming one of the biggest retainers of funds from European Union money. And of course, as we now have Brexit, this is going to be a very severe loss, not only in funding, but the potential loss in the interaction that is so clear here within the European community. This community has become so strong in science, and without the European Union, I do not believe this would have happened. So we do have this problem. And when I was Chief Scientific Advisor, we put forward in 2008 our Climate Change Act of Parliament. That Climate Change Act of Parliament commits all future governments to a trajectory to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. It produced carbon budgets through a Climate Change Committee of Parliament, and those carbon budgets say that today we should be 40% below where we were in 1990. We're actually 42% below. And by 2032, the Climate Change Committee has given us a carbon budget corresponding to a 57% decrease. The private sector is very happy with that. The private sector knows what investments to make because there's a certainty on the trajectory going forward. And as a matter of fact, when we were trying to elaborate how to manage this process, it was pressure on me from the private sector that drove that Climate Change Committee setting up carbon budgets through. This has been enormously successful. So that in Britain today, we're going to phase out coal completely by 2025, but we're already in that process very, very rapidly. We are switching over to gas. We do see that as translational. Our whole objective is that the car fleet, the ground transport will become driven by electricity, the electricity produced largely by renewables. Now, we have problems. Globally, we have problems. But let's just stress the important things that have been happening. And Christiana is totally with me on this. We have to stress that in, for example, 2014, more than 50% of new electricity installation around the whole world was renewables. Now, what's driving that? That was before the Paris Agreement. It's the commercial reality for many parts of the world that renewables are now cheaper to install than fossil fuel energy systems. And that commercial reality has been driven through by feed-in tariffs introduced in Europe and introduced in California. Those feed-in tariffs meant that European taxpayers paid higher prices to create a new market for renewables, and that pulled the price down. Now, all of this is saying we needed that trust in the public. Well, that Act of Parliament 2008 in Britain, we had 467 members of Parliament voting for and 4 voting against, so we had all-party agreement. This is why I was brought back into the British government by the Foreign Secretary, who I said, well, I've been working with the two Labour Prime Ministers, and you're now asking me to work with a coalition Prime Minister. And he said, it's because we have all-party agreement, and our appointment of you underlines that. So that all-party agreement we achieved because of the trust in science, but it's no longer as it was in 2008. I think if we had that vote today, it may be difficult to predict that we would get all-party agreement. And of course, today what we have is that Brexit movement, the United Kingdom Independence Party, things have swung towards questioning the science in Britain in a way that we had not even seen a glimmer of in 2008. Now, I'm showing up here a code of ethics for scientists. I produced this working with my office in government, but working outside office with a whole group of people. It took us about a year. And what we said was it has to be short. This code of ethics is shown up here in total. Rigor, respect, responsibility. Some people have already referred to, for example, listen to the aspirations and concerns of others. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but my idea was the scientific community not only has to get its act together, it also has to be seen to be getting its act together. And by publishing this, the intention was that it would become part of university curricula. I'm afraid that hasn't happened. The scientific community is very keen to get the science through in the university courses, but this kind of thing gets lost. And I think that's a shame. I think the one further thing I want to stress is this point about risk analysis. How do we set out the risks when we're uncertain? Well, the answer is go and talk to an actuary who works for an insurance or reinsurance company. If you have a house and you're worried about the possibility that your asset may get burnt down, you take out an insurance policy against that happening. And the actuary who works out what you should pay, even though it might have a 0.0001% chance of happening in a given year, he knows or she knows how to make the calculation work. Because if another insurance company offers you a cheaper policy, you'll take it. But if the policy is too cheap, the company goes bust when a bunch of houses are burnt down. So these people, we brought into this risk assessment around climate change. And I worked with the governments of China and India. This was in the run-up to the COP meeting in Paris. I don't think anything had a bigger effect on a group of people. 120 of us worked on this for a year than this report. All of us were actually shocked by the outcome. We must not simply put out a statement saying, this is too difficult for us to calculate. We have to do probability analyses on the improbable things that have a very big impact on society. And that was the nature of the work we did here. I worked with admirals, generals, leaders of government from both India and China in this group of 120 people. And the result is very uncomfortable reading. Chinese government put forward 3 challenges from climate change. Please work out the probability of the impact. Now, all of those challenges, such as all rice crops fail in a given year, have a low probability today. But with that one, even a 0.5 degree temperature rise above the present, and that probability is reaching 1% in a given year. And that's, no government would want to face up to that sort of challenge. 1% in a given year, I'd say, is quite a big risk. So what is terribly important is take on these difficult issues. Risk assessment is looking at, for example, extreme weather events and how the gradual transition in sea level rises, temperature rises, is making the impact of extreme weather events more serious. And those extreme weather events become more frequent, perhaps, but even if they don't become more frequent, because of the rising background, the impact is much, much more severe. Now, what I do want to say, however, and this is very important, and if I can have a moment or two just to take you through this, we need always then to say, how do we manage these risks downwards? you have to take some fire prevention measures, perhaps, when you take out an insurance policy on your house. So what we have with the global community today is still a risk in terms of providing 100% energy without the use of fossil fuels going forward in time, which we have to do. And in order to achieve that, we need to develop technologies that are not yet in the marketplace, such as a whole string of energy storage technologies. We need to develop smart grids on both the microgrid and the large grid scale. We have a whole bunch of challenges ahead of us. These challenges represent a massive opportunity. The clean energy sector last year nearly spent $500 billion. This is a massive opportunity for companies to come in and meet the challenges of the clean energy sector going forward. We're estimating this marketplace will be worth $2 to $3 trillion a year by 2020. And so what we set up, and this was at the first day of that Paris COP, this is a wonderful photograph of heads of government. There's one non-head of government in that group, you may have picked out. Heads of government standing there saying, we are committed to this program, Mission Innovation, which means by 2020 we will be spending $30 billion a year of public money on clean energy research and development in our public institutions. Gates is there, he phoned me up, brilliant idea, I'm going to back it with $1 billion of my private money. He saw the opportunity, he's not out there with philanthropic money, he saw the opportunity to make money. Right? And so what we have is a Breakthrough Energy Coalition, 27 wealthy people backing this up. So what we're turning this risk into is a massive opportunity for the private sector. The solution, therefore, is always look at the risk, set it out in its horror, of course, if it looks horrible, but then make sure that you've got a mechanism for dealing with it. So I think while our biggest problem is the uncomfortable truths that science comes up with, we make it far less uncomfortable if we show how we can manage the risk going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that. We covered a lot of ground there. I'm not going to attempt to summarize it. There were one or two things that I want to touch on, and I'm going to be purposely a little bit provocative here. One of, I think, the common themes that most of the panelists mentioned was question of trust. And David talked about how trust in science collapsed in 2000. Heike also mentioned the fact, and was built up and now is low again in the UK at least, and Heike mentioned that she doesn't feel that scientists are necessarily under threat, and I'm not sure I'd agree with that. I think if you look at something like the Climategate email, in inverted commas, scandal, you know, that there are concerted efforts, that's a specific one, but there are concerted efforts to undermine the credibility of scientists. And why, as a community, should we not have implicitly trust from the public? You know, why do we lose it? If I go to my GP, I'm not expecting him to lie to me. I'm not expecting him to, he or she, make up some sort of story for the sake of it. Why would the public think that scientists would do that? And so I think there are, you know, we should explore the issues of why we think, perceive or know that the public and policymakers don't trust us for some reason. Christiana mentioned ivory towers. I feel that's a little bit of a pejorative term, and I mean, related to that, I was trained to be a scientist. I wasn't actually, and most of us were not trained to be communicators. And I think amongst us there are some very good communicators, but we have to play to our strengths, and not all of us want or are good at communicating some of the science that we do to, let's say, policymakers, because that's a particular skill. Should we all be doing that? Let me see. Yeah, so I don't know if people want to. Trust, I think trust is something that we really should tackle. Why, if you think that's the case, have scientists lost the trust of the public and policymakers, if that is the case? Yeah, does anybody want to? David?
You mentioned the UEA Climategate effect. That was post-Copenhagen. The climate change community was in quite a pessimistic frame of mind, and it was the climate deniers' day of outing. The result of UEA Climategate has been, I would say, a withdrawal of key scientists from the public statement capability. I'll give you an example. The president of the Royal Society in Britain, when he was made president, I'm referring to Sir Paul Nurse, went on television and talked about climate change. And he was pilloried, he was attacked in a way that has never happened before. And this immediately got him and others to withdraw from getting into television and radio debates. I'm simply going to say to this audience, it's up to us. We have to get out there. We have to spell it out. And yes, this community is a nasty community. I have received some pretty severe threats when I said, for example, that climate change was a more severe threat to humanity, for example, than terrorism. I got the biggest range of threats you can possibly imagine, most of them from the United States.
So that's a good point. So how can the scientific community protect themselves, or how can others protect us from that? Because I mean, having a thick skin isn't really, you know, that's not the answer, because people are not going to want to receive thousands of emails of death threats and, you know, you're the worst person on the planet and this kind of thing. You know, is there more, for example, that organizations like EGU and AGU can do to support scientists and to protect them and perhaps in some ways insulate them from, you know, I don't know, these kind of extreme views and pressures?
I'll comment on what AGU does do when that occurs, but I first want to make a comment, Jonathan, on your scientists have lost trust, you know, like the scientists have caused it. I'm not sure that's exactly what's happening.
I wasn't suggesting that scientists have the cause,
maybe.
But if there has been a loss of trust, you know, why and what can we do to repair that?
Well, my own perspective on this as someone who is not a PhD scientist is that the threat of climate change is so severe that addressing it is an economic threat to many, many, many established ways of business. So we're dealing with huge amounts of economic disruption here. There's economic opportunity for those who are in the space of the technology development or renewable energies or new farming methods or whatever you want to pick. But there's huge disruptions occurring in other economic sectors that enable people in the United States to have cheap gas so they can buy big cars. Do you know what I mean? And we don't have good public transportation between cities, so people want a car, you know? So I think there's huge economic interest at risk at that are trying to, at least in the US, they go by quarterly profits and, you know, that's what they get rewarded for. They get rewarded for making money for their share. I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying that the economic drivers that could be impacted by more quickly adopting what needs to be done to address this risk are causing funding and things of people to speak out and to skew the science. So I think that has eroded trust. Sure. But in the U.S., if you ask public opinion polls, who do you trust? They say they do trust scientists, actually. They get rated very high. So, you know, what AGU will continue to do, and what we have done is, For example, when there were requests to get the emails of Michael Mann at University of Virginia, we spoke out forcefully.
Yeah.
When both Republicans and Democrats on a particular House committee in the past year have asked for the emails back and forth of people before they testify in front of them, we have spoken out in support of the scientists, including and for scientific integrity. We provide sessions at our meeting, at least from the U.S. perspective, with an organization. There's a climate defense legal fund that's been started by scientists, and we give information available that they can use that. So we have strong statements on scientific integrity. So I think it's incumbent on the scientific societies to get out of their comfort zone a little bit and be willing to publicly speak up on a regular basis when these intrusions occur, and to provide opportunities for their members and others to get access to tools and resources to help them as individuals when they're under attack.
Christiana.
So I'm not sure that the loss of trust, so to speak, quote unquote, is actually a problem of the messenger. I think it's a problem of the message itself, and this really, I think, is a good case of killing the messenger when what we have is a discomfort with the message. I think, in particular around climate change, that the complexity is so overwhelming, and the sense of individual helplessness is so deep that there is a chasm between what can I do as an individual and what is science presenting me here as the overwhelming complexity. And so it's that chasm that puts many people into a place of discomfort, and that then gets translated in, well, I don't want to be uncomfortable, so therefore I better distrust science. So it's not about the science as much as it is about, what the heck am I going to, if this is really true and I feel so helpless, how am I going to bridge that gap? Yeah. And I think there's two things that I would say to that. The first is to make sure that when we communicate, and I don't mean ivory tower in any pejorative way, Jonathan, I mean that, yes, I understand that there's a training for science and there's a training for communicators, but communicators cannot be exempted from understanding the basic science, and science cannot be excused from doing basic communication. I really think that we have to bridge that gap. And so to begin to walk ourselves cautiously away from the fear of not being 150% right. And scientists, God bless you, right? But you always want to be right to the nth degree before you say something or before you go out and publish something understandable in your community. But for the rest of the people, I think, you know, if you extract yourself from your understandable granularity and go to a higher level of agreement, then there can be a statement of this is the agreement, and a range of agreement is fine. But I do expect scientists to have opinions that I can work with, in addition to being, you know, going further and further into granularity. But going up there and communicating opinions based on science is very, very helpful, because it begins to guide at least the direction that we should be walking in. And the second thing that I think would be very helpful is actually to build alliances with those scientists that are presenting the solution. Hello, the solution to science comes out of science, right? It is science that is at the base of every single one of the technologies that is going to get us out of this mess. And so to say, oh, well, science is the problem and we don't trust it, just completely misses the mark, right? The fact is, science is waking us up, and we have to understand what that message is. But science is also providing the solution. And it is a compelling, not only is it a compelling scientific imperative, it's a compelling economic imperative. Because as we have heard, the fact is that all of those technologies are becoming more and more and more competitive, and therefore they are going to be the winning technologies of the future. In fact, many of them are the winning technologies of the present. So to bring the science imperative and the economic imperative together in a way that is understandable, I think is actually a good goal.
Brilliant. All right, look, so what I'm going to do now is open it up to the floor and take questions from the floor. What we'll do is we'll take, I think, 3 questions in a row, and then we'll deal with those as we go along. there are two mics. If you want to go, and here, if you just want to line up behind the mic. One more. Yeah. Okay, lady in the front there. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. If you could just say who you are and then give your question.
I'm Bernard Frank from EGU, but also ISA ESTEC. Clearly, you have reiterated that climate change is a big threat, big opportunities, large amount of money, big conflict of interest. And my fear, and I would like to bring that in the great debate, is that it has a very high profile as well, and it has attracted a lot of attention and removed attention from other goals. If you take the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, we are not addressing them as much as we do with climate change. So we are going to invest tens of billions to address climate change, but many of the other goals, poverty, clean water, and others, which could require lower amount, are not addressed as well. So could we also see that the scientists are not used to have an imbalance of how we address the general goals?
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Yes, hello. I'm Malcolm Taylor from New Zealand, University of Waikato. And my question is really aimed at Sir David King. First of all, Sir David, I'd like to congratulate you on your code of ethics. I think it's a brilliant idea and should probably even be introduced at high school level rather than wait till university. However, my question relates to that code of ethics, particularly as to the part about don't mislead. And on the slide behind you at the moment, I see a photo of H2O being spewed into the atmosphere over a caption to deal with carbon. Isn't that photo misleading?
Well, what's the question?
Isn't the photo misleading?
Is the photo misleading? Okay, we'll take one more.
My name is Jan Boon. I'm from Canada, retired from the Geological Survey of Canada. And it occurred to me, and this is a question really to all panelists, that if you look at the composition of parliaments or provincial legislatures, you find lots of lawyers, you find all sorts of people, but you find very few scientists. And in Canada, there's one example of a scientist, Michael Weaver, who actually is a climate scientist and who is now a representative of the Green Party in the province of British Columbia. And I see that as an example. And I feel that what would we have to do to encourage more scientists to become involved in politics, following the guidelines that you had up on the screen? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll start with those three for now. So one was related to Sustainable Development Goals, and are we basically going for the right ones? If you like, the lowest hanging fruit with those, I think, was the essence of that. A very, very specific question for Sir David. Too few scientists in government and the political sphere, I think, was the third one. Well, let's knock the photo on the head, shall we? let's do. Just get that one out of the way. Yeah.
The photograph was not chosen by me. But more importantly, nor was the heading. And I was really pleased that the editor chose that heading because it's an article about climate change saying it's the biggest opportunity of our age. So I think I agree that is STEAM, of course.
Okay, good. Well, Heike, did you want to say something?
I can say something. Okay, so I would start with a question on is climate change being overrated compared to the other Sustainable Development Goals? I think the point here is that the Sustainable Development Goals are fairly new, and climate change is a problem that's been around for a long time. So I think currently there's more emphasis on climate change just because this has been around for a long time and a lot of people have gone into it and a lot of people are already studying it. But I'm very impressed. When I go to conferences about climate change now, they almost seem more conferences about sustainable development. So I don't think actually you're observing right there. I think there's a big shift towards addressing the whole sustainable development goals, of which stabilizing climate is, of course, one. But I think all of the topics are on the agenda. It's just a matter of inertia, basically, that the scientific community has to get into the topics, get to know people, and they are more difficult. As I said, it's a wicked problem. You need social scientists on board. You need to make new connections. You need to start building new research groups, and you have to have a completely different approach to doing your science. So I think it's a much more difficult topic as well, and I think that is leading to some delay, and certainly to a delay in coming up with answers. But I don't think this is being disregarded at all. I don't know. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take on that. My take is that there is no way that you can answer climate change in and of itself, because the way to put forward some solutions to climate change is precisely to do it through energy, which is an SDG, through better use of agricultural practice and land use, which is an SDG, through better cities, more livable cities, which is an SDG, through better infrastructure, which is an SDG, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact is that if there is a mistake, quote unquote, it's about putting climate change as a separate SDG. The fact is that it pervades through most of the SDGs. And we will not be able to answer climate without doing so throughout the SDGs, and conversely, unless we can bend the emissions through all of those different sectors quickly enough, we will have impacts on human well-being and on the economy that are so huge that we will not be able to achieve the SDGs by 2030. So the link between climate and SDGs is absolutely intrinsic, indivisible, and is being pursued at the same time.
Can I just quickly add, I agree 100% with that, but I'm now speaking as the British government. Our aid program, which is about $14 billion a year, is the biggest aid program in the world, is entirely along the lines that Christiana has just described. We reckon that something like 15 to 20% of that is aimed at climate change, but we do not attempt to separate it out. So, for example, Energy Africa, rolling out electricity to villages that are off-grid, that's about 620 million people in Africa who don't have any electricity, became our objective by 2030. We can do that with renewable energy because it's distributed without extending grids to those villages, and the cost is 2 to 3 times less than extending the grids and increasing capacity.
David, I'm going to interrupt you here because I think we're kind of moving towards some very specific issues related to climate change action, and if at all possible, we want to keep the focus a little bit on scientific integrity and the politicization in particular of science, and what we can do to protect the scientific community. And I wonder if you or one of the others wants to comment on the question about not enough scientists involved in government. Okay, Christine.
So at least, I mean, regarding scientists in government, in the U.S. until this current administration, which we still don't know who's going to get appointed in all these various positions below the secretary level in the government agencies, actually, if you look past Republican and Democrats over the past 20 or 25 years, there actually have been a lot of scientists that have served in very senior positions in the government agencies, and there have been credible White House science advisors. Whether or not you agree with what that administration might put out as a policy, there actually has been credible science. Let's remember the EPA started under a Republican administration in the United States and made great strides in doing things with regulation and other things related to SOx and NOx, for example. That happened under Republican administration. So in Congress, it's different. There was one physicist who's now currently the head of AAAS, was defeated in the last election. But there is increasing interest in those who are just finishing their PhDs to participate in fellowships All the science agencies, including AGU, provide a stipend for a year for somebody to be a Congressional Science Policy Fellow. And those individuals, if you track them over time, end up either working in government on Capitol Hill in certain agencies, staffing the key science committees, or they work in think tanks or other things. So they usually take that experience and put it in to action. Our trouble is finding enough funding to support them all. So this year for one slot we had 40-some applications, and they were all really highly really qualified applicants. There's also, though, an issue in the academic scientific community that culturally doesn't reward scientists who want to do things that are in addition to their scientific research. And so we also have to think about rewards and recognition for individuals who are choosing a path in science that is not the track of staying as a research scientist for their entire career.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that, Christine. I'd make the observation that having scientists in government doesn't always work out perfectly, and this might be a slightly controversial comment, but remind some of you that Margaret Thatcher was a chemist, and some of us here might not have thought that that particular government was good for science, for example. In fact, during the Thatcher years, funding for science went down significantly, so just bear that in mind. I'll take 3 more questions now. So we've got a queue there. If you want to go up to the queue, there are people already. So yeah, do you want to fire away and give your name and affiliation and question?
Hi, I'm Mace. I'm from the University of North Carolina, and I'm a graduate student in science now. But when I was little, I was kind of very opposed to science because it seemed very cold, very unfeeling, and like it always valued logic, practicality, and efficiency over things like patience, unselfishness, or like appreciating nature, or just like slowing down and appreciating life in general. And it seemed like science had nothing to do with human warmth and compassion, and I know that's not true completely now, but I also think that others must have felt the same way that I did. So do you all think that that might be playing a role when you see that people don't trust science or scientists?
Thank you. Gail.
Well, I think that was a great question, actually, so thank you for letting more questions come up. Gail Whiteman, Lancaster University. I'm a business school professor, and I work with a lot of big business, and I try to bring natural science into the boardroom. And it seems that I'm always scrambling to try and find journal articles that can be read by the C-suite. And I'm wondering, this is really a question for Heike, I think, what is the responsibility of journals like Nature or Science? Would they consider doing sort of a hybrid with Harvard Business Review and getting, the important scientific advancements and understandings written in a way that the C-suite could actually understand? Thank you.
I am Barry, hydrology PhD student in Germany. I want to make facts great again, as per the title of this debate. And one key method I take away so far is communicate. Christiana specifically said, communicate early, form an opinion. How do I do that in the light of uncertainty? As soon as we're talking about a real project, there is uncertainty. Should we build 20 dams in this Himalayan river? What's going to happen to flood risk in a changing climate? It's really hard to answer. It's uncertain. So how do I communicate, form an opinion, or communicate an opinion in the light of uncertainty?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great question. It's a question that the IPCC have kicked around for a long time. So I'll just summarize. I mean, I'm really paraphrasing these questions. Science is unfriendly, lacks compassion. Is that, should we do more to better communicate to non-scientists through kind of higher level journals or other fora that we're not currently exploring or utilizing, maximizing, particularly to the business community? And how do we communicate in the light of deep uncertainty? Great questions, actually.
The first one?
Go on.
Should we pick who's going to do what?
Oh, well, what do you want to do, Christiana?
I was very attracted by clarify the first one. Science.
Unfriendly. Okay.
Yeah.
Unfriendly science. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, as you can imagine, in order to deliver the Paris Agreement, my 24/7 job was to find common ground among everyone who had something to do with this. And so I devoted quite a few years of my life to finding common ground. The most exciting common ground that I nurtured and witnessed was the common ground of the science community with the spiritual community. And when those two communities were brought together, it was absolutely tantalizing, the common ground that was right at the nexus between those two communities. So no one can tell me that science is unfriendly, and no one can tell me that spirituality is untrue, because the common ground between those two is, I think, what moves the world.
Wow. Okay, thank you for that. Heike,
yes, there was one
follow that if you can.
Directed, sorry, that'll be difficult. There was one question directly to me, obviously. How can we get science out into the business world?
Well, and wider communities.
Wider community, okay. And I think the big journals, Nature and Science, are trying to do that with as well as they can. But there is a difference in what business wants and what we can supply, because we kind of put out there what is being done at the moment. We kind of write news stories about recent developments in science. Now, I think policymakers and also business people tend to have very specific questions that they want to have answered in order to make their next business decision. And it's very much more difficult to put out something that's actually useful to them, and they have very little time to read through the literature. So I think this would have to be a very specific product to develop, to produce something that is directed at specific communities. And I think here's where the climate services come in. That is an idea that's been floating around for a while now, and in several countries, climate services agencies have been developed that specifically look at questions asked by businesses, by local people who want to, plan the next orchard with apples or whatever, to see how climate will change and how climate change will affect their businesses. So I think this is not something that can be done by the journals, because journals need to address a broad audience. Because each question that people have in the business world or elsewhere will probably be too specific for the broad audience. I think what we need is more bespoke kind of answers to bespoke questions. Specific questions need a specific answer, and I think that needs some more work and extra research as well. And it's not something I think the big journals are very good at doing. What they are good at doing, and what they are doing, I think, is have a news section, put things into context, make sure findings that are of broader relevance are visible and are being read and are being put out there so that people can see. And I think that's all being done as well as we can, actually. But the specific, how to get it into the boardroom, I think, is something you need a different approach for.
Okay, thanks. David, do you want to tackle the third question, which is communicating science in the light of deep uncertainty?
I think this is very difficult, but at the same time critically important. And I can only, again, draw from my experience in government. The best example that I had was H5N1 as an avian flu, and the risk was that the virus mutated and became a human virus. Human beings picking it up directly by direct contact with chickens were at risk, but they weren't able to pass it on to other human beings. If it became a human virus, we estimated that wherever it happened in the world, within 6 months, there would be about 1 million deaths in Britain of human beings. So this was a massive impact if it was going to happen. And we just had to calculate figures for me to give the Prime Minister on what the probability was over a 20-year period of the virus changing. And the answer we gave was 1% chance. But it could have been 0.1, it could have been 2%. In other words, the error margin on the probability is very large. But nevertheless, on the basis of that, the British government and the American government developed vaccines against H5N1. It was very expensive. Public money went in, and in Britain, we vaccinated people very broadly. So the protection was put into people, even though the risk was very low. And I think every case needs to be thought through very carefully. And perhaps the most important thing is you need to be sure that you're not alone. You need to be sure that whatever you communicate, you can take a wide group of scientists with you on that analysis.
Yeah.
So about 4 years ago, AGU conducted a study to see how scientists could more effectively communicate about climate change science. And what we learned from that study was that individuals, let's take it below the senior policy levels, but individuals who are just living and working every day, they want scientists to give them the facts, and they want them to tell them what they know and what they don't know, but they don't want scientists to tell them what to conclude. They actually want to they feel they're intellectual. If you give me information, I can make good decisions. And so I think that's really the fear among the scientific community, that we don't know all the answers and we have uncertainty, sometimes leads us to think that we shouldn't speak out or talk about what we know and what we don't know, because it can get politicized. I understand that in the policy environment. But at local community levels, individuals, whether they have formal education or not, really would like to just know what the facts are, but they don't want to be told what they should do with the facts. They want to be able to make their decisions on what they should do personally. Now, that's a very hard thing to kind of stop short of for all of us, because we know what the risks are. But also, I think over time, we have to think more about that, be comfortable saying what we know and what we don't know, and not necessarily assuming that we have to tell them what to do with that information. So it's part of that listening and dialogue type of approach.
Okay, thanks. We've got quite a long line of potential questions, so we're either going to have to speed up or run over or cut it short. So one of those three. Do you want to kick off?
You. I'm Lydia Messling, and I'm a Leverhulme Climate Justice Scholar at the University of Reading. So we've talked about climate change scientists talking to policymakers and members of the public, and my area of research is looking at scientists and advocacy. So I was wondering what you would think about what areas are okay for scientists to engage in advocacy with, and indeed maybe even ethically bound to engage in advocacy with, and what areas are complete no-nos in terms of advocacy, and how are we to identify them?
Thank you.
My name is Sophie Lewis. I'm at the Australian National University. The panel spoke about the erosion of trust as if it's almost a unique challenge for science, but we could also make an argument that this is part of a wider trend where society's relationship with institutions is changing. And for example, other scholarly pursuits such as the social sciences have long had to fight for relevancy. So what can scientists learn about professional practice in the contemporary world by looking around and outside of science?
Thank you.
Hi, Anselm Logus, University of Helsinki postdoc. I'd like to hear your thoughts on scientific literacy and illiteracy of the general public and especially policymakers and journalists, because if you look at how science is, or the policy implications of science is communicated to the general public, this often happens through discussions of politicians with journalists that are then televised, and more often than not, these people clearly don't know what they're talking about. You hear things like, well, climate change is just a theory, or evolution is just a theory, and clearly these people do not know what a theory is, else they wouldn't be saying this. Do we need to make a better job of explaining to people how science works and making journalists, politicians, and the general public more scientifically literate? If you compare this to the 1960s, the golden age of science, it was called earlier, we took a rocket to the moon. That's a simple concept that you can explain to a 3-year-old, but climate change isn't one of these simple problems.
Okay, thanks. I think we got your question. How does science work? And yeah, Yeah, thank you for that. All right, let's go for those three. So science advocacy, what we shouldn't be in terms of advocacy, relationship to established institutions, and almost kind of best practice in gaining trust in other disciplines that have faced these sorts of issues, and how science literate are policymakers. So,
should I start on the advocacy one?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, I'll start with the science and advocacy question, perhaps, because I also mentioned it in my initial statement. I think the problem is that people shouldn't really use their clout as scientists to make statements outside their core expertise. As I said, everybody's got a right to their opinion, but to say, okay, I'm a top scientist and therefore I can compare something like peace and democracy with the importance of climate stabilization is perhaps, I think, is a problem, because they know a lot about climate stabilization and they may not know as much about peace and democracy and what happens when those break down. So there's a kind of necessary myopia. You know a lot about one thing and you don't know quite as much about the other thing, and then it is very difficult to give impartial advice. So I think people need to have an opinion, but to advocate specifically, I think, is problematic unless you have an expertise in the other subjects that is matching your expertise in the science arena. So, taking Angela Merkel, who is a physicist, she obviously knows what policy is all about, and therefore I wouldn't mind if she, as a scientist, makes political statements, because she's a politician as a basic job. But if somebody spends 100% of their time or 95% of their time being a scientist and very little time possibly just reading the newspapers on understanding policy, then I think advocacy is difficult, because they don't have the matching expertise in the other areas. So I think, as a rule of thumb, in where is science advocacy appropriate and where not, I think one should always clearly state the opinion, but make it clear how much time has gone into coming to that opinion, and on which subjects the expertise lies, and on which subjects the expertise does not lie, to get a fair assessment of how much the public should trust this opinion. And then there's the point that you mentioned. Basically, I think our role as scientists is to put out the facts and not to make recommendations what should be done. I mean, I have an opinion of what should be done, but I shouldn't prescribe what should be done. And I mean, as I said, the IPCC is very clear on that. They are policy relevant, they are not policy prescriptive. They want to make sure people have the understanding what will happen if CO2 rises. They don't want to say, and therefore we should do only this and forget about keeping peace. It's very important, I think, to people. I think with the science communication, the problem is, the two classic problems is, it is always easy to underestimate people's intelligence and overestimate their knowledge. And I think we need to put in the knowledge, we need to put in the facts, we need to give them the information. And then I think they're intelligent enough to make up their own mind what they want to believe. And I think we shouldn't try to prescribe the opinions. We can give our own opinion, but that's not more important than their opinion. So we need to respect somebody else's right to have their own opinion. Sorry.
So then there was the question about, can science learn something from other disciplines that face these sorts of issues? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about that. I think question for us to ponder during the lunch break, maybe. And the third one was literacy of policymakers, and should we do more to inform policymakers and the public about the scientific process, how it works, the mechanics of it? Are we sort of missing a trick there, in effect? David.
I think this is a very, very important question, and whenever I've got time, I do go into schools because I think that's where scientific literacy really needs to be developed. It's young people. And the response is absolutely tremendous. If you walk into a school and talk to a bunch of 100 kids, you can get these concepts across in a way that they really do understand how we operate in science. And doing it by giving examples. I think this is a critically important question. We do have to reach out and develop scientific literacy much more broadly. And I want to come back, these very wise words. Don't underestimate intelligence and don't overestimate knowledge. Because most of the people we're dealing with are extremely intelligent. And if you're very careful in talking to them, don't talk in your private scientific language. We come back to that point about Spanish. If you talk to them carefully, you will get messages through. Prime Minister Blair, one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, and if I talked carefully to him, he would sit for hours listening to the science. But if a scientist went in who wasn't used to talking in that simple language, he got terribly impatient after 2 minutes and would kick them out. So it is a matter of how you communicate.
All right, thanks for that, David. I think we're going to have to finish the questions from the floor, I'm afraid. Thanks very much for that. I'm actually going to use my chair's prerogative and ask a burning question which was on our list, which hasn't been addressed yet. And so I've been a scientist, been doing science for about 35 years now. And during my scientific career, I don't remember having a debate like this, ever. I don't ever remember there being a March for Science. So my question is, are we in a unique place? Is this somewhere that we've never been before as a community? Are we, is the erosion of trust, the threats to scientific integrity greater than they've ever been? Or is this just a cycle? Is this something that we're experiencing all the time? And one of propaganda is as old as the spoken word. So is there something particularly different about now? Anyone want to? Christiana?
Well, I think it is different because I think what's happened not just with science, and actually we should remember the Science March just wasn't individuals who were scientists marching. There were a lot of science supporters marching all around the world. I think that there's been a realization that citizens have become complacent about being active and involved in the issues they care about. And so I think the Science March is one example of that. I participated in the Women's March in Washington. That was another one. You all weren't there probably, but you'd be surprised how many we support science, we support facts signs there were in a march that was supposedly about women's and diversity and inclusion issues. So at least in the US, it seems to me that this election has done more to unleash the ability and democratic inclination, and we might see a new rise in democratic involvement. I don't mean Democrat like blue or red, or but just the underpinnings of democracy. And I think people have realized they've been complacent, and that their voice isn't being heard. And maybe we'll see people voting more all around. The percentage of voters has been quite low.
Christiana?
So I'm exactly where you are, Christine, not just because we have similar names, because I'm actually truly grateful, and I'm a born and very stubborn optimist, and I always see something positive in anything that's happening. But I have actually started a letter that says, "Dear Mr. Trump, I want to thank you for the following achievements during your presidency. despite you. And the list is going to be a long list, because here's what has happened, you know, in reaction to this populism, not only in the United States, but also in other countries, there is an incredible rise, mobilization of the public who are being kicked out and provoked out of the complacency and out of our comfort zone. And that is fantastic, is because we in the climate movement, honestly, after Paris Agreement, we sort of went into, oh, aren't we wonderful, we got the Paris Agreement. Well, no, you know, we still have to actually implement it and implement it on time. So we're being mobilized much more, and B, even more importantly, we're being mobilized across the issues. Totally with you on that, right? It's not just that climate is mobilized or women's rights are mobilized or, you know, any human rights are mobilized. All of these communities are finally dropping their silo mentality and working with each other, because they see that everything, all the progress is actually under threat. So I am grateful for that mobilization, and I'm grateful actually for the awareness that we have to work across the sectors toward the betterment of mankind, and we will win.
Well, I actually think that's a very positive and, you know, cry to arms, and a great point to end this, union session on. It's been fascinating. We could have had double the amount of time, and there are lots of other questions. I'd like to thank the audience, but I'd particularly like to thank our fantastic panelists. So please give them a big round of applause.